Could I invite everyone back to just a quick summary? You can sit at your chair again, or you can stand, whatever you feel comfortable. It's going to be a very short summary, and then we're going to head off. So can we get everyone over in this direction? We've got our 3 panel members. Yes.
I'm Alexander.
Oh, you're Alexander.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, we have 3 rapporteurs, and I think I'll just start with the person closest to me, Alexander, and then we have Annalisa, and we have Tim. They've all been roving around trying to capture your thoughts and reflections, and that will be our summary for this session. So please, Alexander.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I must confess that I'm very excited but also nervous because it's the first time in my entire life that I'm serving as a keynote listener. But there's a first time for everything, I guess. So I found the discussion, so I was able to follow the discussion in 2 of the roundtables for some time. It was quite fascinating. Actually, the first roundtable, the number 4, provided me with an excellent starting point because the discussion focused on the need to define secondary impacts. So what is it really that we are talking about? And besides, actually describing those impacts, there was one element that was also raised, and that is, there's also an additional layer of complexity in terms of the timelines involved. As we also heard from the presentations before the World Café, the impacts are often observed a long time after mines are closed, for example. And there was also one of the discussants mentioned that in many cases the political terms, the government terms, are much shorter, than the timelines which need to be considered when looking at impacts of secondary, especially also secondary impacts of mining. In this context, an interesting idea was proposed, and that is to develop indicators that would allow us to actually quantify and qualify those secondary impacts and perhaps even their cumulative effects, because that is another layer of complexity that, they have some cumulative effects. And of course, and I was, as a representative of the scientific community, very pleased to hear that reference was made in this context to the need for data, obviously, and the role which the scientific community can play in trying to find and compile and analyze such data. And what I found very interesting was that, of course, we are aware that under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, there is currently a process underway of developing indicators for the various Sustainable Development Goal targets. And there may well be good opportunities for synergies, for trying to really also identify indicators that could be used for quantifying or qualifying those secondary impacts of mining on forests. I then made a big move to another roundtable, and I ended up in a discussion about drivers of mining, basically. And what was interesting is that this provided a relatively clear linkage also to REDD+, in that, it was mentioned that a lot of mining is being carried out by small-scale miners, artisanal miners, and Pedro actually pointed out this continuum from small-scale to large corporate miners. And it seems to me that the sense in the group was that REDD+ could actually work best, or the mechanisms in place in the REDD+ context for incentivizing action that would reduce secondary impacts resulting from these small-scale mining activities. Oftentimes, smallholders do not require large, big incentives in order to change their actions, their activities. So perhaps this could be a good entry point, a kind of a close link between REDD+ and small-scale mining. Then again, the other kind of extreme of this kind of continuum, it was pointed out that mining is a very capital-intensive industry. And that is something that could also provide some kind of a hook for change, in that it requires a lot of investment. And investors actually could be this is this accountability element. Investors could be held more accountable for also taking into account increasingly the secondary impacts of mining on forests. we could also think of reputational risks, and also that came out in the presentations before, raising consumer awareness, so all these kinds of things, the pathways, you know, market mechanisms that could actually allow us to motivate investors to also take into account secondary impacts of mining on forests. And I believe now I've used up my time. I've taken actually more than I should have. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, so here's the abridged Shakespeare version of the discussions that were held today. So I'll start with a reflection on impacts. So defining secondary impacts is extremely challenging. It's a complex situation. There were questions around where does the responsibility of one party stop and another one start. But a recognition that there's a need to have a much more multidisciplinary approach than perhaps has been historically the case. So bringing the social scientists together with the environmental scientists and dealing with what are really increasingly complex situations by bringing those different parties together. Modelling and scenario planning, for example, might have a role within that as well. There's a need to consider infrastructure as well as the individual sites themselves. And also to consider positive as well as negative impacts. So in this group here, we were talking for quite some time around the negative social and environmental impacts, but there was a recognition expressed that we needed to focus also on the positive and balance those. In another group, there was a reflection on data, and a similar theme to you, but questions raised around who owns that data. So whilst data may be available, it may not be accessible to decision makers. It may not be in a format that's appropriate for them to use. There may be gaps in that data. And the red agenda and some of the investment that's going into the assessments of threats could help to plug some of those gaps. New technology could play a role in monitoring impact and measuring that impact over time in a way that it simply hasn't been possible to as a result of costs in the past, and that could open up new avenues for accountability and transparency within the industry. Another topic of discussion was around the need for better coordination between ministries, which a number of the speakers mentioned earlier, and a recognition that when that coordination actually did happen, which it did, which it has done in a number of cases, that the issues experienced in identifying and managing secondary impacts were that much smaller, and the benefits that came out of those developments that much larger as a result of that coordination. And finally, questions were asked around how do you incentivize consideration of secondary impacts within the mining industry, and perhaps framing that through the lens of natural capital and consideration of dependencies on ecosystem services might be one way of creating a stronger business case for the private sector to engage more fully on these issues, given that many of them simply aren't considering cumulative or secondary impact or even understand it at this point in time. I think that's probably 3 minutes.
Thank you, Annelies.
Thanks. I have 3 reflections, but first, congratulations to the 3 groups that I could listen to for the dynamic conversation. I actually just arrived in Nairobi from a 2-day workshop in Naivasha outside of Nairobi on a very similar theme, looking at mining and environmental governance and human rights and gender. And it was great to see some of those themes reflected also here. The conversations I listened to, perhaps not surprisingly, went well beyond issues of red data and but in a good way. So my first reflection is about something that many touched on, which is perhaps, given the broad nature of secondary impacts, beyond the need to define what those are, for an integrated data system. And along with that, as we just heard, the need for a coordinated system, largely led by the government, but not only, that would allow for all that data to be used, because, of course, it's not just about data, it's how the data is picked up and used. In terms of what data, so again, because of the great range of secondary impacts, a huge wealth of data, including that of a more environmental nature, including that available through RED and some of the new technologies, GIS and others, traditional EIAs, SIAs, ESIAs, etc. But much more beyond that, if we look at secondary impacts that are linked to migration and some other social impacts beyond just health. so involving in data related to migration and employment trends over time, of course. This is my first reflection on what types of data and how to address it. A linked question, and these go back to the framework questions for the session, is who to engage, both for collecting and using data, but also for other issues around planning. And of course, a range of stakeholders were mentioned. Pleasantly, many times local communities, and we talked about ways to ensure meaningful engagement. But of course, the role of government, a range of line ministries, NSOs, and other traditional data providers, plus the private sector themselves and other sources of data. And within this group of people to engage, we also had a chance to hear about shared responsibility. So of course, from a human rights perspective, the government is a duty bearer if we're looking at the human rights related impacts of the human right dimensions of secondary impacts. And as part of this shared responsibility, we of course heard much about the need for legislative frameworks starting from constitutions and working down. But really it became clear that our discussion was much more than data. It was about the need, as we heard at the very first presentation, for looking at landscape, spatial, or regional development issues from a much broader perspective in terms of integrated planning. Let me stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks to all three of you. That's very, very helpful. Let's give them a hand. I think, well done, well done. Well, I have to say that for a topic of mining, it seems that we've spent a good afternoon mining some very important ideas and themes, and not only from a primary but from a secondary perspective. I want to thank our rapporteurs, our photographers, our social media folks who are capturing things, and give them a hand, because they really made it possible for me to step in at short notice and make this work. And thanks to all of you for your contributions. Very, very important. I think we really came with some questions that really asked what kind of information and knowledge do we need? What are the ways that we're going to reduce the impact of secondary effects? And is RED working? And we did a pretty good job. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you all very, very much. And we're now going to a reception upstairs. You have all of 10 minutes to catch your breath, maybe even a little less, 8 minutes. So just get some fresh air for a couple of minutes and then come up to a reception upstairs, and we'll introduce some things when we get there. Thank you all very, very much, and be well.